Hello. I hope you're well. I hope your family is well. We are living in unprecedented times. Unless you're over 100 years old, you have never lived through a pandemic like this one. It's changing our families, the way our families interact. It's changing society. It's changing industry, and it's changing warehousing. So what I am here to speak today about is best practices in engaging warehouse workers. And most of the content around this was conducted in a survey before the pandemic. 176 respondents, mostly director and above, mostly North American. But you can't, in today's world, talk about engaging your workforce during a pandemic unless you also talk about safety. So we'll also talk about pandemic best practices. I'll put on my thinking cap and think a little bit about, once this pandemic goes away, what's going to be different in warehousing. So before we get into the survey, I think all of us, if we follow the trade publications around warehousing and logistics and supply chain, have been seeing stories about how difficult it is to get staff and to keep staff. It's always nice to start with hard statistics around those kinds of situations. So the U.S. Department of Labor shows that the average salary for a warehouse worker is about $19 an hour, which is a pretty good salary. If you figure 2,000 hours in a work year and you throw in benefits on top of that, we're talking, about a $50,000 salary. And I think we know that most of the folks that work on the warehouse floor, they have a high school education or less. Many of them are non-native English speakers. There's a fair number of folks that have criminal records that work in the warehouse. So that's a pretty good wage for that set of circumstances. There has been wage inflation over the last 5 years, 3.9%, about 4%. The rate of inflation is about 2%, a little bit above that. So, wages are growing about 1.5 times faster in the warehouse than they are across the United States as a whole. So there are things to be concerned about. But if you listen to the stories about how difficult it is to get workers, I'm surprised the number around wage growth is not higher than it is. And when you take that roughly $19,000 average wage and you compare it to minimum wages around the country, warehouse wages look very good. So the survey, I was looking at 4 different areas. What are the best practices associated with productivity? What are the best practices associated with customer service, which basically we defined as being related to the quality of work. If you're not picking it in a highly accurate way, customers aren't getting what they ordered. We looked at engagement, labor engagement, with the key statistic being, did companies have 10% turnover or less? And we looked at safety. So in terms of labor engagement, what we're actually in all 4 of those areas, what we're looking for in determining what a best practice is a delta of 20% or more. So I'll give you an example. One of the things we looked at to see if it was a best practice was the size of the warehouse. Among companies with over 200 employees, 26% had employee turnover of less than 10%. But among companies with less than 25 employees in the warehouse, 46% had turnover of less than 10%. So that's a 20% delta. The small warehouses are doing 20% better on that metric than the big warehouses. So we looked at about 40 different things that might be related to retaining full-time employees. We only found 2 things that were strongly associated with that: the size of the warehouse and whether the warehouse was considered a very clean place to work. We also found, surprisingly, wages were not associated with retaining workers, full-time workers in a warehouse. And we found one thing that was negatively associated with retention, and that was hiring your workers from an employment staffing agency that specialized in staffing warehouse workers. We did find, when it came to retaining part-time employees over the full contracted period of their temp job, four things that were worth looking at. Having, again, a small warehouse was related to retention. Having in that warehouse more than 90% of the employees working full-time, that made it more attractive to work over the full term. Wages did matter for temp workers. Paying at least 50% more than minimum wage to new workers mattered if you wanted to retain them across that full contracted period. And again, we came across the temp agency finding being negative correlated with being able to retain workers. So here I've talked about best practices in employee engagement in a warehouse. But how much does it profit any organization to do a really good job of retaining their warehouse workers if it's not a productive warehouse, if it's not a warehouse doing quality work, if it's not a safe warehouse? So I think it's also interesting to say across all 4 of those dimensions, what are the practices that help you do all 4 of those things simultaneously? And so we had measures of success for productivity, for customer service and quality, for people. It was that same, less than 10% turnover a year when it came to the people thing, for safety. And across all of the respondents, working at all the different warehouses, 176 respondents, top warehouses were only 17% of the respondents. Only 17% of the respondents were at the top level of each of these 4 success metrics. And again, we looked at over 40 factors. Here are a few of the things we looked at. And what did we find were best practices in running a top-tier warehouse that was productive, that had good quality, that had low turnover, that had safety? Some of these you've heard about. A well-lit warehouse, a clean warehouse. Those things still matter. Doing 360-degree reviews on managers. So at the end of the year, when a manager goes through their review process, it's not just the manager's manager that is giving him feedback. He's also getting feedback from his peers, other managers, and he's getting feedback fed to him from the people that work for him. Companies that provide management training in how to give effective feedback are much more likely to be top-performing warehouses. Companies that have self-managing teams, so the teams understand what the goals are, or what their metrics are, but they figure out themselves how to do that work as a team. On the next thing, although wages were not related to being a top-performing warehouse, recognition was non-financial remuneration in the form of giving teams or employees food like pizza for doing well in a given week or a given period, giving them time off, giving them other rewards that are not financial in nature for high performance. Managers that frequently monitor individuals as they do their jobs and provide on-the-spot positive reinforcement, those are much more likely to be top-performing warehouses. And workers need to be monitored at least once a month to make sure that standard operating procedures and best practices are being used. Now, we had, I'm just going to go back a slide. We had 8 total best practices. Half of them are related to management best practices. The way you manage your workforce matters. Let's go to pandemic best practices, right? One of the questions we asked was around safety. And we asked, do you believe 75% of your employees would consider this a very safe warehouse to work in? Obviously, that number would be a lot lower during the pandemic. And obviously, it's going to be highly correlated to warehouse turnover in the current environment. So I'd like to tell you a story about one multinational that got things right, and they got things right very early. The company is called Agco. I didn't put them in there, but I got permission to name them after this speech was submitted. And they are a manufacturer of tractors and other forms of agricultural equipment, and they've got plants and they've got distribution centers all over the world, including in China. And they would have calls every week with key members of their global teams, just saying, how are things going in your part of the world? And back in January, they started hearing their Chinese managers talking about something we now know as COVID-19. And Chinese citizens are very reluctant to say anything that contradicts what the government is saying publicly. But they were saying things in these conversations like, the government is reporting this, but the mortuaries are full and people are packed outside of the mortuary. And the government is saying this, and this is what we're seeing. And so they knew in January the scale of this in a way that even American citizens and citizens of other countries were not yet aware of. And so they put together their global pandemic task force. Some of their factories and warehouses in China had to shut down. And before they could open them up again, they had to demonstrate to Chinese health authorities that these were safe environments to work in. So very early on, they had practices in place, like monitoring the temperature of workers as they came in, making sure workers were standing on mats 2 meters apart from each other. And when it was somebody's turn to have the temperature taken, everyone would walk from one mat to the next so that they'd still be social distance. They were doing social distancing in the warehouses. They were taking workers to break rooms in staggered fashion. They were doing what we now consider best practices all the way back in January. And they had the PPEs because they saw it coming. They did a mass buying of personal protective equipment. They stocked it in Chicago. They would ship these items to factories or warehouses that they thought were on the verge of going into lockdown. And they shipped them also to their key suppliers so that their key suppliers would keep sending them the components and supplies they needed. But they had one condition. We'll send you these PPEs if you work on our orders first. Then they had a real-time risk monitoring system. So as an example, in Needham, where I live, every week there's an online, we get a little paper, and it's online as well. It talks about the number of people that have been infected in Needham. And in some weeks, there's actually people that die. This real-time risk system that they had, it goes online across the world and scours online news publications and social media for these kinds of news tidbits. And they were often able to predict 4 or 5 days or more that a nation was about to shut down by pulling together the national statistics as well as the local statistics, because sometimes it's a region that's more impacted than the country as a whole. And when they thought that a country was about to go on lockdown, their warehouses and factories in that region started working overtime and shipping everything out of the region to places where this stuff was needed ahead of time. So really an excellent story, I think. But Manhattan also has a labor product council. And there were several phone calls with this labor product council around suggestions about how to keep workers engaged, keep workers safe in this current environment. And here are some of the suggestions here. You know, it is a tough time to be working in a warehouse. People do worry about their safety. So there were companies paying $2 or $3 as an hourly premium for working in these conditions. They were saying, some of the companies were saying, take whatever you need at the break station. It's free. Take a Coke out of the vending machine. It's free. If there were hard to find items at a grocery store, someone from the company would go and would get that stuff and just say to people, you know, we're giving you these items free to charge. You don't have to make a trip to the supermarket. From a health perspective, it is a best practice to test your workers as they go into a warehouse. The threshold for fever is 100 degrees 0.4 Fahrenheit. If someone tests at that level or higher, you retest them in 15 minutes. If you get 2 tests in a row that say they have a fever, they have to go home. They should be wearing masks as they come in. They should be wearing personal protective equipment in the factory. If they call in absent, you need to ask them whether they have COVID-19 symptoms or not. There should be stations with wipes to wipe their surfaces down. Every work area should be wiped down every 4 hours. You should be spraying down things like put walls where there's a lot of touching going on with industrial spray cleaners rather than using wipes. I've started to hear about there's autonomous mobile robots that are not being used for picking. They're being used in hospitals, and they emit ultraviolet radiation. They actually do a better job of killing germs like the COVID-19 virus than Clorox wipe type products. They've been widely used in hospitals. Some factories and warehouses are starting to buy them. They work particularly well in e-commerce warehouses because the UV light has to come very close to a surface to work well. So, you know, if you've got a stack that's 30 feet high, it's not going to work at the top of the stack. Social distancing, you know, stagger start times and break times and prop open all the doors. When people go into a break room to take lunch or to take a break, only 1 chair per table. Draw lines on the floor if possible and use social distancing. If it's possible, have people walk down aisles and up aisles in one-way directions. Don't let there be two-way traffic through aisles. Plexiglass shields where it makes sense to protect people as much as possible. You might find it necessary to suspend attendance programs and to soften performance disciplinary programs. You're going to need to extend break times for cleaning and sanitation. You need to focus on communication. A lot of the warehouses that will be open will be designated as critical industries. And if you're a critical industry, just like Agco was, let people know how important it is that they are doing what they are doing. So what's going to change? No one knows, but this is my take on it. First of all, brands can be negatively impacted by poor treatment of workers. For some reason, there's certain brands that, there's negative publicity and nothing seems to stick. So, for example, there were workers in Amazon warehouses complaining about safety, and they actually fired those workers. And they got a little round of publicity, but it's certainly not affected their sales. In other cases, there are meatpacking plants that have been shown to be unsafe places to work. I think it highly likely some of these brands will be impacted by what's going on. The other thing is, we are now in a global recession. It looks like a bad recession. It's not going to be like flipping the light on when things start to come back to normal and the economy is going to come roaring right back. There's been damage done. And it's also likely that we'll start to open up areas, and then that R factor, how easy it is to contract the disease, will go over the number one, and they'll start to shut down those states or cities again until they can get the infection contagiousness rate down. So we're going to see opening and shutting and opening and shutting. When it comes to a recession, we've been talking about practices in engaging the workforce here. When I first came to this industry and studying warehouse technologies, I remember that labor management systems based on labor standards were really an important tool to drive productivity. And the idea was, we want workers, we want them to work at a continuous pace. We don't want to push them too hard. We want them to be safe, but we want productivity. The last several years with e-commerce, and with it being more difficult than it has historically to get workers, there's been a lot more focus on keeping workers happy, making sure they stay on the job, making sure if you have to hire new workers, you're hiring the right kind of workers. So are we going to go back to the days where it's all about labor productivity? Is engaging with workers still going to be important? Where are we going to be on that scale? And I think one thing I want you to take away from the presentation today is there are best practices associated with both keeping employers engaged and working and with productivity. It doesn't have to be either or. And management matters. E-commerce, it was already growing at double digits. If anything, this has reinforced that trend. It's probably going to grow faster than it has historically. That's going to mean more need for workers. And that's going to mean that the automation market is going to continue to move. Autonomous mobile robots is already growing at double-digit rates, and that's just going to keep going. So in conclusion, keep safe. We're entering a new world. We've never seen a world like we're living in today. We don't know exactly where things are going, but I think best practices are best practices, and it's worth knowing what they are. And you can have both employee engagement and a very well-run warehouse.